Hello, and welcome to our lecture today on Frederick Jackson Turner's Frontier Thesis. If this is your first time encountering this particular concept and theme in American history, you might not be alone. For those who have perhaps encountered Frederick Jackson Turner before, his thesis or his ideas basically are best identified as such. He argues that the sort of central current, the central theme in American history is the notion of the frontier. So he's writing this in the late 19th century at the close, or what is considered the quote unquote the close of the frontier in the American West. So his perspective is from certainly a white male American looking at the course of American history near the end of the 19th century. And again, what he really sees as perhaps the dominant theme in his view is this notion of moving west, that there is always more land available west, right, from the Atlantic to the Pacific, that since the arrival of Europeans in the 1600s, there has been a continuous and often violent clash with indigenous peoples, and then that story of the clash and the expansion and the technology and even the violence, and even the idea of the frontier pushing further and further west, he argues, right, is in his view the most dominant theme in American history. And with that, right, we can start to unpack it. One of the things I want to think about again near the end is how is the frontier redefined in the 20th century? And you might also think about how the 21st century, how it's been redefined in the 21st century, how we sort of understand this terminology now. But when he's using the term frontier, he is literally talking about that invisible imaginary line that was first placed all the way in Jamestown, Virginia, between colonial quote-unquote property and indigenous land, and then how that invisible line, right, keeps getting pushed further and further west all the way to California by the end of the 19th century. And this image is often one that is associated with, sort of the personification of this concept that there is this woman, virtuous white woman leading the cause west, right? And they're sort of following this concept of Lady Liberty, leading them to a magical place. Of course, in this depiction, right, we don't see, if we see indigenous people, they may be here. You see, these sort of symbols of quote unquote progress from the railroads, right, and the telegraph wires and the carriages, and the cities in the distance sort of moving this way, right? Again, that the sort of current of America is sort of forcing it west. And I also think it's important, as you to consider this, to also consider the environmental and weather and climate of California currently, and its natural disasters and the proliferation of wildfires, as well as to the other sort of natural issues that are having many wonder if California can continue to sustain the kind of population that it has had throughout the post-war part of American history. Anyway, I think when you look at this, it's also, interesting to see what you don't see. So you don't see, although you see Native people sort of moving out here, you don't see any of these. It's interesting what you want to call them, right? So pioneer will be a word that is not used outside of elementary or middle school. You might say Anglos. You could say land robbers. I mean, there are a number of things you could say, but they're depicted almost exclusively as white, rather than as the sort of ethnic diversity that really does make up the American West. So just to recap, Frederick Jackson Turner um, publishes the significance of the frontier in American history thesis in 1873, and again pushing forth this idea, at least in terms of scholarship, that American history um, is the story of the colonization of the West. And with that, it has really shaped American culture, it has shaped American society, um, and this sort of rapid, what he would call Americanization, also promotes specific types of ideas, right? It promotes individualism, often at the expense of the community. This is also going to be, right, a direct contrast between white capitalism and the idea of sort of communal ownership amongst the indigenous of North America. Also, the idea that individualism promotes democracy. Well, wow, is that an interesting idea, particularly now in the 21st century, right? I think we can definitely argue that perhaps the result of too much focus on the individual actually is a threat to democracy. But he is saying, right, that this idea of the individual has actually been really central to the practice of American democratic project. And also then that this frontier, which, and this part is also really interesting to think about, that the frontier is a crucible for an Americanization. And what is meant by that is that this process of moving west, of sort of facing the challenges of that frontier, be it from living in hostile environment in terms of the terrain, or perhaps having to survive indigenous attacks, or having to come up with a unique way of living because you're not in a city. He's arguing that for all of the different people that are making up the West, including immigrants, immigrant labor, African Americans that are emigrating from the South in very large numbers after the Civil War, there is a process of that West that is creating a uniquely American identity. And I remember I used to have these conversations with students in 212 about this mythology of the West. Is the idea that moving west provides more opportunity than places in the East, that you can do things out in the West that allow one to be more free. In many ways, we can sort of see that those ideas still exist. I don't know, however, if because of technology and because of other factors, if it's as powerful. So that's also something to consider, right? That perhaps this idea of the West is much more culturally specific than rather and baked in the DNA of Americans. So that's something. The other thing, right, is to consider what he says about the frontier as a uniting aspect. Well, this is certainly arguable, particularly from the perspective of the indigenous population, who did see colonization as a great unifier for Americans, but against themselves. He writes, obviously, the quote-unquote Indian was a common danger, demanding united action, and perhaps that is true, and it certainly is a galvanizing factor in the U.S. military, and it certainly is a factor for the U.S. military to include African Americans and Mexican Americans and Filipino Americans and a variety of type of ethnicities within its ranks. And it's interesting, if it unites Anglo America as well as ethnic America, it is uniting only in its opposition to the indigenous who are already here. So this is a really interesting idea to unpack and sort of sit with and try to understand in American history. And again, that sense of unification really is most demonstrated in the sense of nationalism, which of course, in the U.S. context, we can never really separate ideas of American nationalism from ideas of racial superiority. So, although Turner is not addressing race specifically, and if you look obviously within the language, he's not. And as a white male of the 19th century, he's not really going to. But we can, right? We can start to unpack what that means, and also see how we can inject, right? What happens then if we inject critical race consciousness and critical race theory into these concepts, and then we get something that's quite interesting. I also want to ask you to think about, just sort of briefly, and I'll give you an exercise, right? So think about how many cars, or rather trucks, you can think of that are named after the American West. So I'll give you a few seconds to think about it. How many can you come up with? Trucks named after the American West. And when you start to think about it, right, you're going to come up with a lot. You're going to come up with the Ram. You're going to come up with the Bronco, although I don't know if you guys know the Bronco. I know Will knows what a Bronco is. You're going to come up with a Tundra. You're going to come up with all of these names that are associated with the West that sort of speak to this cultural connectivity that the West and these sort of open spaces, and as well as the geography, but the mood and the people, offer something that is sort of uniquely American in opportunity. So I wanted to really bring that up and to really understand this as a sort of central pattern, because once the frontier is gone, right, as it will be gone by the end of the 19th century, the U.S. controls all the land from Atlantic to Pacific. We have effectively colonized all of our part of North America, placing the indigenous people into reservations, stripping them of citizenship, and waging war on them to the point where their numbers are so low, and our technology has really enabled us to colonize in every measurable way. What does that mean? If the dominant force in American history had been that need to conquer the frontier, quote unquote, then what does it mean when that frontier is conquered? So there are a number of ways that you might look at that. And again, as he's writing this in 1873, excuse me, we are only sort of at the beginning of what will be American imperialism, right? The idea of then conquering territories outside of our designated borders. That will include Hawaii, that will include Guam, that will include Puerto Rico with the Spanish-American War, and then moving on to other sort of forms of American imperialism as they are defined throughout the 20th century. But then in the post-war years, right, by the 1960s, we can see a new definition of the frontier, as President John F. Kennedy mentions this in his inaugural, I think it's his inaugural address, about what the frontier now means. And that means, going to the moon, conquering space, right? Utilizing our superior technology for scientific discovery, and but not only that, but claiming that discovery in the name of America. And so I'm curious what you all think of the idea of the frontier now, and if that means something more, technologically technologically specific, like AI, or the frontier is sort of the unknown that is coming because of our shift in climate, or if perhaps the frontier is now us teetering into a, fascist state. I'm just throwing all possibilities out there, or perhaps even more interestingly, if the concept is no longer relevant. So I do want you to consider all of those things as you really think about how this idea of the frontier really intersects with American exceptionalism, right? Because American exceptionalism will tell us then that this colonization has been good, like that the violence, the pursuit of the frontier in all of its forms, from the technology that's used to sort of, um, you know, um, quarter land off and prevent grazing, and also you can't have buffalo roaming if you have, train tracks going through um, the area, right? Like there's a physical assault on the land that comes with colonization, and the theory, or Turner would say, well, that's good. It's worth it. It's progress. It's needed. Um, However, it is that is that progress really progress? I mean, we have an opportunity again to sort of really unpack what all of this means, and what it really means to look at it historically. And again, this influence on exceptionalism. The exceptionalists would tell us that this colonization is good. Um, the American exceptionalists would tell us to sort of focus on how conquering is going to lead to these innovations that lead to jobs, that lead to perhaps a better standard of living, quote unquote. So there are ways to definitely see how these two ideas are connected, and yet, how they both sort of have different justifications for the sort of overwhelming violence that is also the result of the American Democratic Project. And I think I just wanted to show you some of these images that are connected here. And of course, part of what is leading the end of, or the closing of the frontier, really, is the slaughtering of the buffalo, as the buffalo do not really survive. And they become, in many ways, a great sort of metaphor for the end of the West, as the buffalo are also dying and being killed off in massive numbers, as are indigenous people who are also, and you learn a lot about sort of the placing of indigenous on reservations, but think about how these reservations typically aren't close to a water source, right? So you're removing people from fresh water, you're removing people from many opportunities to make money, and then you're saying, oh wow, look, they're poor. That poverty is not the result of, access to jobs, or not having any training, or actually being colonized by a foreign people and not speaking their language. No, it's because there's something innately wrong with them. So the racial argument is certainly used to defend and justify this placement of people in small, upon this new experiment of reservation and confinement. Here you have sort of a interesting collection. Remember, the term cowboy itself is as an interesting racial history, as the term is considered derogatory in the early part of the 19th and the mid 19th century, as the term cowboy was racially specific to black men. The term cowboy, as it becomes understood after really the closing of the West, is a product of culture, right? Northern writers, people writing about the West who don't really know what the term means, and ascribing it to whites. So this is also an interesting example of how culture changes the meaning of the word over time. And of course, think about these land rushes that began from the Homestead Act in the 1860s throughout the 19th century. There are a number of times where there is the belief to have so much of abundance of land that people, if they come and grab it, right, they claim it from themselves, they get to keep it. Well, it's indigenous land. So part of sort of the U.S. government prompting this is to have citizens say, I'll take it. I'll take it off your hands, sort of doing the work of the military for the federal government. Of course, homesteaders. And of course, I think the interesting terminology, homesteaders versus exiters. But of course, African Americans are going to settle and throughout Midwest and Western territories, Tulsa being one of those places, building very strong middle class, wealthy areas that are also then, targets for white violence and systematic economic theft. And of course, I want to show you the beef bonanza, right? How to these sort of helpful guidebooks on how one can make it out west and you can do the same, right? If only you follow in the footsteps of people like James Brisbane. I found this photograph fairly interesting because it sort of speaks to the multi-ethnic, multiracial makeup of the physical building of the West, which is done with immigrant labor. Many Irish, also many Asian, many coming from China, as well as African Americans. And as you think about this, right, think about what the closing of the frontier also means in terms of the violence. Does this mean that the violence is worth it, right? And again, if the frontier is closed and the frontier has been the seminal theme, then it also sort of goes to figure that we will have to keep finding these quote-unquote new frontiers to pursue. And with the support of an idea like American exceptionalism, then it then supports that expansion regardless of the violence. So continue to think about sort of the idea of the issue of violence in American history and how we deal with that, both as students, as potential teachers, as scholars. Is there violence sort of baked into the DNA of Americans in ways that perhaps are exceptional, right? Is our exceptionality about violence? I don't know. These are all things that I miss talking to you in person about, but are very much worth having. And I also think that there's a mythology of the West that is striking, that often is not sort of met in reality either. And perhaps if we focus more on the violence that was needed to colonize the West, then we can help to sort of demythologize the process and gain more insight. As a place like Montana is also going to be the state that also allows women's suffrage for the first time, decades before, I think it's decades before the 19th Amendment. You're also going to have different ideas about sexuality, different ideas even about race and ethnicity in parts of the West than we see in other parts of the country. So I do see that there might be like multi-layered tracks of understanding the West. But when you're driving down the road next time, please look around. See how many, not only trucks, but cars are named after the West. And I think that once you also start to see it in life, it also, you can start to appreciate more of just the depth of what this approach means. Now, again, you don't have to use his approach. I say if you want to take aspects of this, you can. And there are ways of doing that which are quite effective. But knowing these concepts and these frames also gives us a better insight not only into American history, but really how we understand methods, right? Because part of this historical method is to really look at strands in society, these and if you start to unpack this frontier thesis, you could look at it from the perspective of culture, right? How you see it produced in plays and and ideas about the frontier really presenting themselves across American literature, music, things like that. You can also look at it in terms of society, economics, technology, and the environment. So let me know what you think about this. I look forward to hearing your thoughts very soon. Let me know if you have any questions, issues, or concerns.